Lena Carter walked into the courthouse early that morning, the hum of the city outside a constant reminder of the busy day ahead. The courthouse steps were crowded with people hustling in and out, lawyers, clients, witnesses. It felt like another typical day in the grind of the legal world. But Lehman knew that today was different. She had a case that could make or break her reputation at the firm. A young woman had been charged with a violation that seemed minor to everyone except the judge. She glanced at the case file again, quickly scanning the details before entering the courtroom. The fine her client faced was severe, far beyond what seemed just for such a small infraction. The system had been this way for too long, penalizing those who have the least ability to defend themselves and the least resources to fight back. Lena took a deep breath and stepped into the courtroom. As she walked toward the defense table, her eyes met the figure of Judge Peter Mitchell. He was seated at the bench, staring down at the case file in front of him, his face stern and unreadable. A veteran in the courtroom with a reputation for handing out tough rulings, Mitchell wasn't known for showing mercy or for bending the rules for anyone. Lena had heard stories about his no-nonsense approach. The way he would sit silently for long stretches during hearings, his eyes locked on the defendant like a hawk waiting for the smallest sign of weakness. As Lena prepared to address the judge, she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been building all week. It wasn't just about the case itself, but about the larger implications of what it meant to face such a figure in the courtroom. There were whispers about Mitchell's methods, the way he handed out sentences that seemed disproportionately harsh for people of color. In particular, Lena had heard her colleagues talk about it, and she had even been a victim of his rigid ruling in the past. He had imposed a heavy fine on a friend of hers for what seemed like an innocent mistake, the kind of mistake anyone could make if they had the wrong circumstances. But today it wasn't about her or her personal feelings. It was about her client, the young woman who was trying to fight for a chance at a fair hearing. She knew the law, she knew the facts, and she was determined to give this woman the best chance she could in a system that had failed so many before her. Lena rose to her feet and addressed the court, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her head. She started with the facts of the case, reminding the judge of the situation at hand and the context of the violation. But as she spoke, she could feel Judge Mitchell's eyes on her, calculating, silent, almost disinterested. It was as though he had already made up his mind before the case even began. The prosecutor stood next and delivered his argument with a confidence that seemed to fuel Mitchell's indifference. The courtroom was tense as Lena's client shifted nervously in her seat. Lena could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that came from years of knowing the system was not built for people like her, and no amount of legal argument or eloquent speeches would change the fact that a harsh sentence was looming. Lena tried one last time. She appealed to the judge's sense of fairness, pointing out the extenuating circumstances, the personal hardships her client had been through. But Mitchell only glanced at her briefly before giving his verdict. He raised his hand, and with a firm tone he imposed the maximum fine. The young woman would face a financial burden she could never hope to overcome. Lena's stomach twisted in frustration, but she kept her face calm. She had to remain composed. It was only the beginning of the fight. The real battle was just beginning. Lena sat at her desk long after the courthouse had emptied for the day, staring at the case file in front of her. The judgment from Judge Mitchell still echoed in her mind. The fine had been harsh, perhaps even unnecessary, and it had broken her heart to see her client, someone who had barely enough to survive, forced into a financial hole she would never escape. Lena thought about what had just happened. Her arguments had fallen on deaf ears. The system was unyielding, and today it had been her turn to face the brunt of its rigidness. But as she shuffled through the rest of her work, something strange happened. An email notification popped up in her inbox, one that made her pause. It was from her boss, Rachel Bennett, and the subject read, "Case assignment. Urgent." Lena clicked on it, wondering what this new task could be. As she read through the details, her heart skipped a beat. The case was high profile, a civil lawsuit against a sitting judge for racial discrimination, and it had just been handed to her. She leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. The name of the defendant took her by surprise. Judge Peter Mitchell, the same judge who had just imposed that harsh fine on her client. The very same man who had set a precedent in her mind as someone who wouldn't bend. The assignment felt almost surreal. How could this happen? It was almost as though the universe had thrown her into the lion's den. And yet, something deep inside her pushed her forward. Maybe this was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. Lena spent the rest of the evening absorbing the details of the case. The accusations against Mitchell were damning. Multiple individuals had come forward, claiming the judge had consistently given disproportionately severe sentences to minority defendants, especially Black and Latino individuals. Witnesses had provided testimony, and legal experts had drawn clear comparisons between the judge's rulings and the national averages for similar cases. In short, Mitchell's behavior seemed anything but impartial. Lena couldn't help but think of her previous cases, the ones that had gone under Mitchell's gavel. There was the time he had dismissed her argument about a defendant's background, ignoring the fact that he had been a product of a broken system. And then there was the young woman today, the one who had been hit with an absurd fine for something so minor. It was becoming harder to ignore the patterns that others were now pointing out. Maybe Mitchell wasn't just an old-fashioned judge. Maybe there was something far darker at play. The more Lena thought about it, the more personal the case became. She wasn't just fighting for her clients anymore. She was fighting for the very principle of fairness that had first drawn her to law. There was no way she could back down from this now. The stakes were higher than ever before, and it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about exposing a flaw in the system that had been ignored for far too long. The next morning, Lena woke early and prepared for her first meeting with the team handling the case. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, trying to ignore the mix of excitement and nervous energy buzzing in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, not the least of which would be the very judge she was about to take on. But Lena had always been determined. If there was one thing she knew for sure, it was this. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. Lena arrived at the office early the next day, feeling the weight of the case ahead of her. She knew that going up against Judge Peter Mitchell was not going to be easy. He had a long-standing reputation, and the legal community respected him, if not feared him. But there was a part of her, deep down, that couldn't let go of the belief that this fight was about more than just the case. It was about justice, about fairness, about ensuring that no one, especially not a powerful figure like Mitchell, was above the law. The meeting with her legal team started promptly. Rachel Bennett, her boss, led the discussion, outlining the evidence they had gathered against Mitchell. There were testimonies from former defendants, court clerks, and even a handful of other attorneys who had witnessed the judge's behavior firsthand. The most shocking part of the case wasn't just the accusations. It was the consistency of the pattern. Mitchell had been known for imposing harsher penalties on minority defendants, often without providing a clear legal reason for his decisions. Lena had read the case files thoroughly, but seeing everything laid out in front of her made her stomach tighten. She had already suspected something was off, but now it was undeniable. The evidence was damning, and yet there was something that made her hesitate. The notion of taking on a sitting judge, someone so entrenched in the legal system, filled her with both determination and dread. She had to be careful. Every move had to be calculated. The last thing she wanted was to end up like some of the other lawyers who had tried to challenge powerful figures like Mitchell, silenced, marginalized, or even destroyed by the system. As Rachel presented the key testimonies, Lena's mind raced. She thought about her client from the day before, the young woman who had been crushed by the fine Mitchell imposed. It wasn't just her. There had been so many others before her, people who had been ignored or forgotten. The legal system was supposed to be impartial, but as Lena dug deeper into Mitchell's past rulings, she found herself questioning the very integrity of the system she had dedicated her life to. Could a judge's personal biases influence their decisions so profoundly? Lena raised her hand, pulling herself out of her thoughts. "We have to go beyond the facts here," she said, her voice steady but intense. "The statistics are clear, but we need to show the court who the people are behind these numbers. We need to show that these are real lives that have been harmed, not just cases on paper." Rachel nodded in agreement. "Exactly, Lena. This isn't just about proving a pattern. It's about proving that the judge's bias has affected the lives of real people in real ways. As the meeting continued, Lena's resolve grew. She was no longer just fighting for her client or for her career. She was fighting for every person who had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The case had become personal in a way she hadn't expected, and there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, as Lena sat at her desk preparing her opening statements, she couldn't help but think about her previous encounters with Mitchell. She remembered his cold, dismissive attitude, the way he had turned a blind eye to the human element in his rulings. What if he was just a product of the system, a man so accustomed to power and control that he couldn't see the damage he was causing? Or what if he was far worse, a man who chose to wield his power recklessly, with no regard for fairness? Either way, Lena knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about changing the narrative. And to do that, she would need to take on the entire system, one case at a time. The day of the pre-trial meeting arrived, and Lena felt the weight of the moment as she walked into the conference room. She had prepared meticulously for this encounter, but nothing could prepare her for the intensity of what she was about to face. The room was filled with the heavy presence of legal power, her team, a handful of attorneys representing the other side, and of course, Judge Peter Mitchell himself, sitting at the defense table. Lena took a deep breath as she entered. She tried to remain composed, but her nerves fluttered. She had seen Judge Mitchell on the bench before, but this was different. Now he was the defendant. He wasn't just a figure of authority, he was the one under scrutiny. And yet, despite being the subject of a serious legal battle, he sat there with the same air of indifference she had seen countless times before. It was as if the thought of being held accountable hadn't quite sunk in for him. His steely eyes met hers for just a brief moment, and Lena couldn't tell if he recognized her or if he was simply sizing her up, trying to assess the threat she posed. Lena took her seat at the plaintiff's table and glanced around the room. Her colleagues were there, giving her silent nods of support, but they knew as well as she did that this would not be an easy fight. This was a high-profile case, and Judge Mitchell was no ordinary defendant. He was a figurehead of the justice system, someone who had held immense power for years. The implications of this case stretched far beyond the courtroom. It had the potential to expose a much larger issue with how the legal system operated, especially in cases involving minorities. As the meeting began, Lena's thoughts returned to the reason she was here. She wasn't just fighting for her client anymore. She was fighting for fairness, for a system that didn't operate on bias and assumption. And despite the pressure, she felt the surge of determination deep inside her. She was ready. Judge Mitchell addressed the room first, his voice calm and collected. "I stand by my record," he said with a dismissive wave. "All of my rulings were made with the law in mind, and my personal feelings had no impact on my decisions. If there is a claim of bias, it is without merit." The words were rehearsed, the same ones he had used countless times before, but today they felt hollow. His arrogance seemed to fill the room, and Lena could see it was an attempt to establish his authority, to make the room believe he was above reproach. But Lena wasn't buying it. When it was her turn to speak, Lena stood up slowly, her voice steady but forceful. "Judge Mitchell, with all due respect, the evidence speaks for itself. The testimonies from those who've been affected by your rulings are not fabricated. They are real, and their lives have been impacted by your decisions. No amount of denying the facts will change that." She locked eyes with him, refusing to look away. Not this time. The room grew quiet. The air thickened with tension. Lena had never felt so much on the line in her career. She knew that standing up to Mitchell was no small feat, but she also knew that it was a fight worth fighting. She couldn't let him walk away from this. She couldn't let him pretend that his actions didn't have consequences. Mitchell's expression flickered for just a moment, but it was enough. Lena had planted the seed of doubt. She knew that, in this battle, she wasn't just fighting against the judge in front of her. She was fighting against a system that allowed him to thrive for so long without consequence. And she wouldn't stop until that system was held accountable. The meeting ended with both sides agreeing to proceed with formal discovery, But as Lena walked out of the room, she felt a shift. There was no turning back now. She had entered a battle that would test her limits, but for the first time, she was certain of one thing: she was ready for it. The trial officially began the following week, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with anticipation. Lena walked in with a sense of resolve, her mind sharp and focused on one thing: exposing the truth. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, attorneys, and members of the public who had caught wind of the high-profile case. All eyes were on Judge Mitchell, who sat at the defense table with his usual impassive demeanor. His years of experience showed in the way he carried himself, but Lena could see through the mask. This time, the pressure was on him. Lena stood confidently in front of the jury, prepared to lay out her case. She began with an opening statement that set the tone for the trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice unwavering, "this case is not just about a judge who has broken the law. It's about a systemic issue that has been allowed to fester for far too long. The evidence we will present today will show that Judge Peter Mitchell, despite the power he holds in this courtroom, has consistently used his position to unfairly target minority defendants." She could see the jury's attention sharpen, their eyes fixed on her as she spoke. It wasn't just her words that had an impact, it was the sheer weight of the accusations. The room was silent, as if everyone understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. The very foundation of the legal system was being called into question, and that made some uncomfortable. The defense team, on the other hand, wasn't fazed. They had anticipated Lena's argument, and their job was to protect their client at all costs. They argued that there was no definitive proof of racial bias, only circumstantial evidence. Their strategy was clear: to discredit the testimonies of the witnesses who had come forward, casting doubt on their credibility. It was a classic move, one Lena had seen countless times before. But this time, the defense was up against something different. This wasn't just a case of a few disgruntled defendants. It was a pattern, a clear, disturbing trend that had been built over years. Lena presented her first witness, a former defendant who had been sentenced by Judge Mitchell several years ago. The woman, now in her early 30s, stepped onto the stand with a look of quiet determination in her eyes. She described the day she appeared before Judge Mitchell, detailing how the judge had sentenced her to an unusually long prison term for a relatively minor drug offense. The woman explained how, at the time, she had tried to speak up about her difficult circumstances, how she had been struggling to provide for her family, and how she had been caught in a system that seemed designed to punish her. But Judge Mitchell had dismissed her explanation and imposed a harsh sentence, one that had derailed her life for years. Lena could see the impact this testimony had on the jury. They were listening, really listening, to the human cost of Judge Mitchell's actions. As the woman finished, Lena could feel the shift in the room. The defense attorney, who had been poised and confident moments earlier, now looked uncertain. He wasn't used to seeing the jury so engaged with the emotional weight of the case. The trial continued, and Lena called witness after witness. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of a judge who had used his power not to uphold the law, but to uphold his own biases. She could feel the momentum building, and with each passing day, it became more and more clear. The judge who had once been untouchable was now in a position where his past actions could no longer be ignored. But the road ahead was far from easy. Lena knew that Mitchell's team would fight with everything they had to protect his reputation. And she also knew that the case was just beginning to get to the heart of the issue. The truth was out there, but she needed to keep pushing, keep digging, and keep bringing the truth to light, no matter the cost. The trial was nearing its climax, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Each day brought more revelations, more witnesses, and with it, more weight to the accusations against Judge Mitchell. Lena could feel the shift happening, slow but undeniable. The jury, once neutral, was now listening with more intent, reacting to the testimonies that painted a picture of a man whose actions went far beyond the letter of the law. Lena had spent hours preparing her cross-examinations, and today, she would face the most difficult challenge of all, Judge Mitchell himself. It was a moment that she had both dreaded and anticipated. The judge had been silent through most of the trial, but now, It was his turn to defend himself. His reputation, his career, everything he had worked for was on the line. Lena knew that this would be the defining moment of the case. Mitchell was calm, his usual air of confidence unshaken as he walked to the witness stand. His gray suit looked pristine, and his posture was impeccable. He looked every bit the part of a judge who had spent years in control of his courtroom, used to commanding respect and attention. But today, his calm demeanor felt like a facade, a shield that he was using to hide his growing unease. Lena stood as Mitchell settled into the witness chair. She had done her research on him, watched recordings of his previous rulings, and studied every case he had been involved in. But now she was ready to face him directly. This wasn't just about facts anymore. It was about exposing the man behind the robe. She took a deep breath and began her questioning. "Judge Mitchell," Lena said, her voice steady, "you've stated repeatedly that your rulings are based solely on the law. Yet, as we've shown through numerous testimonies, your sentences for minority defendants are disproportionately harsh compared to your rulings for others. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained impassive. "I follow the law," he replied, his voice steady. "I do not base my decisions on the race or background of the defendant. Each case is unique, and I make my decisions based on the evidence presented." Lena pressed on, her tone calm but pointed. "Yet, in case after case, we've seen you impose sentences that go beyond what is reasonable for the crime. Can you explain why your rulings for Black and Latino defendants are often so much harsher than for other defendants, with no clear explanation as to why?" Mitchell hesitated for the briefest of moments, but then quickly regained his composure. "I don't have to explain my decisions," he said, his voice rising slightly. "The law is the law, and I do what is right according to the law." Lena's eyes locked on his, unwavering. "But the law is meant to be fair, Judge Mitchell," she said, her words deliberately measured. "And fairness is not what we've seen. Your actions have caused real harm to real people, and now you have to answer for it." The courtroom was silent as Lena's words hung in the air. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension building as the jury absorbed every word. She was no longer just challenging a judge's rulings. She was challenging the very system that allowed him to get away with it. She could see the cracks in his defense, the subtle signs of unease that were starting to show. Mitchell had relied on his position of power for so long, but now that power was being tested in a way it never had been before. Judge Mitchell remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Lena as if he were trying to read her. But Lena could see the struggle behind his gaze. For the first time in this trial, the judge looked less like an untouchable figure and more like a man on the edge of losing everything. It was the opening Lena had been waiting for. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, but with an undeniable edge. "This case isn't just about the law, Judge Mitchell. It's about justice. And your decisions have caused too much harm for too long. The time has come for you to face the truth." The courtroom was still, the silence thick. Lena could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the weight of their attention pressing down. She had done it. She had pushed Mitchell to the brink, and now the only question was whether he could maintain his composure, or if his own actions would finally catch up with him. The trial entered its final stretch, and the air in the courtroom felt charged, as if the entire building was holding its breath. After Lena's devastating cross-examination of Judge Mitchell, the balance of power had shifted. The defense team worked frantically to mount a rebuttal, but it was clear they were grasping at straws. Mitchell, once a man who had commanded the room with ease, now seemed smaller, his arrogance cracking under the pressure. His earlier confidence had given way to something far less assured. Lena knew that she had to strike while the iron was hot. With the jury now fully engaged, the defense's attempt to downplay Mitchell's biases seemed weak and ineffective. But the final moments of the trial would be where everything would either fall into place or collapse. She couldn't afford to slip now. The defense called their final witness, a psychologist who testified that racial bias in judicial decisions was difficult to measure, and that any discrepancies in Mitchell's rulings were simply a matter of interpretation. The psychologist claimed that the data Lena had presented was inconclusive, and that racial bias was not a clear factor in the judge's sentencing patterns. Lena listened carefully, but her gut told her this was the last desperate attempt to save Mitchell. She had already anticipated this line of defense. She stood up as the psychologist finished, her gaze steady as she walked toward the witness stand. The moment of truth had arrived. "Dr. McAllister," she began, her tone controlled but piercing. "With all due respect, you are suggesting that these patterns of sentencing are coincidental, merely a matter of interpretation. But isn't it true that the very foundation of judicial ethics is based on fairness and impartiality?" Dr. McAllister nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Yes, but judicial decisions are complex and should be viewed in the context of each individual case." Lena didn't miss a beat. "Then why, in every case we've examined, does Judge Mitchell's sentencing consistently deviate from the national average, and in such a predictable manner? Are you suggesting that every minority defendant who appeared before Judge Mitchell simply happened to have a more complicated or more severe case than every other defendant?" The psychologist faltered. "I." Lena pressed forward, cutting him off. "The truth is, the pattern we've uncovered isn't coincidental. It's systemic. Judge Mitchell's decisions reflect a bias that he's either unable or unwilling to recognize, and that bias has hurt real people. And now, Judge Mitchell is being held accountable for that." The courtroom was silent again, the tension almost suffocating. The defense team exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no denying the force of Lena's words. The psychology expert had been brought in to downplay the evidence, but instead, he had only helped to reinforce the argument that Mitchell's behavior was not an isolated issue. It was part of a larger, deeply ingrained problem within the legal system. Lena took a breath and turned to the jury, making her final appeal. "We are not asking you to judge the man sitting in that chair," she said, nodding toward Mitchell. "What we are asking is for you to judge his actions, to look at the lives that were altered, the people who were harmed. We are asking you to hold him accountable, not for who he is, but for what he has done." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the jury. "And in doing so, we ask you to send a message, not just to Judge Mitchell, but to every judge, every lawyer, and every person who believes that they can act with impunity. That no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." Her final words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. Lena returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but she knew there was nothing more she could have done. The case had been made. The rest was in the hands of the jury. As the judge adjourned for a brief recess, Lena couldn't help but feel a mixture of exhaustion and hope. She had done everything she could, but the outcome was no longer in her control. All she could do now was wait. The hours stretched on, but the moment of truth finally arrived. After deliberating for what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. Lena's heart raced as the door swung open and the 12 jurors filed in, their expressions unreadable. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a verdict, it was a statement. Lena sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped in front of her. Beside her, Rachel, her mentor and boss, gave her a small nod, a silent gesture of support. But there was nothing to say now. The arguments had been made, the witnesses had spoken, and the fate of Judge Peter Mitchell was now in the hands of the jury. The judge, his face a mask of professionalism, called the courtroom to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice echoing in the room, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, a tall woman with sharp features. She cleared her throat, glancing at the judge before turning toward the packed courtroom. "We have, Your Honor." Lena felt her chest tighten. The moment was here. "Will the foreperson please read the verdict?" The foreperson nodded, unfolding the piece of paper in her hands. "In the matter of Lena Matthews versus Judge Peter Mitchell, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." A wave of disbelief and relief washed over Lena in an instant. Her heart pounded in her ears as the words sank in. Mitchell's head snapped toward the jury, his eyes flashing with fury, but it was too late. The decision had been made. "We find," the foreperson continued, "that Judge Mitchell did, in fact, exhibit racial bias in his sentencing decisions, and that those actions caused harm to the defendants who appeared before him. Lena's mind raced as the foreperson continued, but she barely heard the rest of the words. It was all happening too fast, and yet it felt like time had frozen in place. Mitchell's face went ashen, his hands gripping the sides of the chair in front of him. He looked like a man who had just seen the world he had built for so long crumble in an instant. The judge called for order, but the room buzzed with quiet conversations and murmurs of disbelief. For the first time, Mitchell was no longer the one in control. The courtroom had shifted. The power that he had wielded for so long was now being stripped away, piece by piece. Lena looked toward the jury. She had won, not just for herself or her client, but for everyone who had been unjustly affected by Judge Mitchell's decisions. The victory was a hard-earned one, and the weight of it settled in her bones. It wasn't just the legal system she had challenged. It was a system that had allowed people like Mitchell to wield their power unchecked for far too long. Now, the truth had been brought to light. As the judge dismissed the courtroom, Lena stood, her knees weak from the surge of emotion that flooded her. She had done it. She had taken on the system and won. But even as she felt the rush of victory, there was a bittersweet realization that settled in her heart. This was just one case, one judge. The battle for justice was far from over. Mitchell, visibly shaken, was escorted out of the courtroom by his attorneys, his head held low. It was a sight Lena would never forget. The man who had once stood above the law, now brought low by his own actions. Lena's legal team surrounded her, their faces a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You did it," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Lena smiled, but it was a quiet, thoughtful smile. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more cases, more battles to fight, and more systemic injustices to confront. But for today, for this moment, Lena knew she had done something that mattered. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, she had changed the course of one person's life. And maybe, just maybe, the course of an entire system.